I'm happy to welcome all of you in person and online to the first Franklin Lewis lecture in Persian literature and poetry. My name is Ahmed Shamsi, and I'm really honored to host this and to be with you in person and do the kind of things that are the things most satisfying, which is keeping some intellectual sohba, intellectual community in which we listen to each other's ideas and commemorate beloved colleagues that we've lost. So I'd like to start with thanking those who made this occasion possible. Sarah Hill, Salma Tahrani, and most definitely Pune Shabani Jadidi, who really, this is the labor of her love to the language, to the literature, and to the person that we honor here. She's the one who had the idea. She's the one who approached a potential donor to make this possible. And we, of course, we would also like to say thank you to this anonymous donor for enabling us to have these meetings twice a year. So this is the first one. There's going to be a second one in May, and then from next year onwards, there's going to be one each. There's going to be, it's going to be more equally distributed over the year than it is this year. So let me hand over to Pune herself to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Professor Shamsi. To pay tribute to Professor Lewis, I would like to begin by reading his translation of Rumi's quatrain 1716, which is versed by a disciple to his spiritual master. زاهد بودم ترانه گویم کردی، سرفتنه بزم و باد خویم کردی، سجاده نشین با وقاری بودم، بازیچه کودکان کویم کردی. I once was an ascet, you made me sing, made me riot of the party, drunk with wine. You found me on a prayer rock, dignified, made me toy for children, taunted on my block. I would like to start this prelude by thanking the generous anonymous donor who made this lecture series in honor of the legacy of Professor Franklin Lewis possible. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Professor Ahmed Al-Shamsi and Professor Thibaut Dubert, who will be moderating today's lecture, as well as the administration team, Sarah Hill and Salma Tehrani, who organized all the preparations that led to this event. Finally, on behalf of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations of the University of Chicago, I would like to thank all of you who have joined us today from all over the world. And we are especially honored to welcome Furuzan Lewis, the beloved wife of Professor Lewis. As you all know, our dear colleague, Professor Frank Lewis, was a distinguished scholar of Persian literature who taught at the University of Chicago for nearly 20 years, and who very sadly passed away on September 19, 2022. Professor Lewis began his study of Persian language and literature at the University of California at Berkeley, earning his bachelor's degree in 1983 before joining the PhD program at the University of Chicago. His dissertation on Sana'i and the origins of Persian Ghazal is still one of the widely read dissertations in Persian literary studies. Throughout his prolific career, Professor Lewis published multiple books and articles. Although his most important book is Rumi, Past and Present, East and West, The Life, Teachings, and Poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi, published in 2008, his scholarship in the field of Persian studies was wide-ranging and included Persian literature and language, medieval Islamic thought and literature, Sufism, Baha'i studies, Iranian cinema, and Persian literary translation. Lewis was a remarkable translator of both classical Persian literature, including Rumi, Obaid Zakani, Ferdowsi, Sa'di, Sana'i, and others, and of modern Persian literature, including Muhammad Ali Jamalzadeh, Zoya Pirzad, Sohrab Sepehri, among others. Professor Lewis was the chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from 2015 to 2018 and from 2019 to 2022. And he was loved and revered by all his colleagues and students, whom he ceaselessly inspired with his love for Persian language and literature. He trained successful students who are now professors of Persian literature in other universities, students like Cameron Cross, Michigan, Samuel Hodgkin, Yale, and Austin O'Malley, Arizona. In addition, he served as the president of the American Institute of Iranian Studies for 14 years from 2002 to 2012, and from 2016 to 2020. His main contributions to the field, his many contributions to the field, his kindness, selflessness, modesty, collegiality, and his extensive knowledge of Persian literature and world literature, and of course his excellent command of Persian language, have left a lasting impression on us all. We hope to honor his memory and legacy with this series of lectures on Persian literature, which is a subject that was dear to his heart. Today it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our inaugural speaker today, Professor Paul Losensky. Professor Losensky, who received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1993, is professor in the Department of Central Eurasian Studies and the Department of Comparative Literature at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he teaches Persian language and literature, comparative studies of Western and Middle Eastern literatures, and translation studies. His research focuses on Persian literary historiography, biographical writing, and Persian poetry of the early modern period. His publications include Welcoming Feghani, Imitation and Poetic Individuality in the Safavid Mughal Ghazal, published in 1998, Farideddin Attar's Memorial of God's Friends, Lives and Sayings of Sufis, published in 2009, and in the Bazaar of Love, Selected Poems of Amir Khosrow, published in 2013. He has authored numerous articles on Persian literature for journals such as Iranian Studies, and is a contributor to Encyclopedia of Islam and Encyclopedia Iranica. He is a former fellow at the National Humanities Center and has served as chair of the Department of Comparative Literature. Please join me to welcome Professor Paul Losensky to his alma mater today to speak about Parts and Wholes, Beyts and Ghazals, Assemblage theory, and the poetry of Sā'eb Tabrizi.
Thanks. Wow, a full house. Try not to panic. Great, it's very good to see all of you. I always enjoy coming north here to speak at my alma mater, where I can count on an informed and engaged audience. That would be you. It is a particular honor to be invited to deliver the inaugural Frank Lewis Lecture, although this is an honor I very much wish did not exist. Frank and I were friends and colleagues for over 40 years, and his passing has left an emptiness in my personal and intellectual life. In his memory, I will turn to two topics that Frank and I discussed time and again over the years. The topic of translating poetry will come up toward the end of my remarks, but let me start with the question of the nature of that most elusive of literary forms, the Ghazal. Since our days as graduate students here at Chicago, Frank and I often wrestled with the issue of the Ghazal's unity, or lack thereof, or, as I put it in my title, the relationship between parts and wholes, between Beyts and Ghazals. Since he is not present to hear my latest take on the topic, let me invite the rest of you into our conversation. But is it worth reviving a conversation that's now 3 decades old? Since the Ghazal earned the dubious distinction of entering the curriculum of the MFA in poetry, definitions of the form have proliferated online. All these definitions agree on one point, There is no relationship between the Beyts, or couplets as the term is now rendered into English. The only unity of the Ghazal resides in the formal feature of rhyme. All of the definitions you see here derive from Agha Shahid Ali's book, provocatively entitled Ravishing Disunities, Real Ghazals in English. Each couplet, he writes, is, quote, autonomous, thematically and emotionally complete in itself. One couplet may be comic, another tragic, another religious, another political. Any insistence on unity he calls crippling, a handicap due to Western reading habits that are incapable of appreciating a particularly Islamicate sensibility. Given this consensus, this overwhelming consensus, is any effort to re-examine the dictum of disunity a rearguard action to reimpose Western aesthetic standards on the literary other? Consensuses, however, can change. In a landmark article of 1993, Francis Pritchett justifiably wrote that, quote, a consensus has developed in the past half century among a number of Western scholars that the Ghazal does in fact have unity, close quote. Beginning in the 1940s and 50s, scholars such as A.J. Arbery and G.M. Wickens argued that the syntactically independent Beyts of the Ghazal were, in fact, unified to form an artistic whole. This idea had one of its fullest early expressions in the work of another graduate from the University of Chicago, Michael Hillman's 1974 book, Unity in the Ghazals of Hafez. Following the tenets of neo-Aristotelian new criticism, Hillman argued that unity was an essential feature of any aesthetic object and consisted of the necessary and integral interdependence of the parts, in this case, interdependence of the parts, in this case the Ghazal and the individual Beyts. These scholars too saw themselves as fighting a cultural battle against the notion that the quote-unquote Oriental mind was incapable of synthetic thought, unable, in the words of Hamilton Gibb, of, quote, throwing off its intense feeling for the separateness and the individuality of the concrete event. The consensus of today and the consensus of 30 years ago could not be more opposed. For today's atomizers, as we'll call them, each Beyt is an artistic whole, for which the Ghazal provides a semantically neutral formal framework. For yesterday's unifiers, each Ghazal is an artistic whole, for which the Beyts merely supply the parts. These two concepts of the Ghazal do not even agree on the basic unit of critical engagement and analysis. In my work with the early modern poet Sā'eb Tabrizi, who died in 1676, I need to have it both ways. On the one hand, Sā'eb is the master of the tak Beyt, the single verse. Hundreds of his individual Beyts stand on their own as complete and self-subsistent short poems, and many have attained nearly proverbial status. Individual Beyts are also featured in an anthology of his work that Sā'eb prepared late in his career, where single verses are organized according to conventional images, such as verses on the curls, kisses, wine cups, and so forth, with absolutely no regard for the Ghazals in which they come from. With digital assistance, I have compiled a similar anthology of single verses using kind of more quotidian images like door knockers and beehives, again, with little or no regard for the Ghazals in which they appear. On the other hand, Sā'eb most often presented his poetry in the form of a divan, in which the Ghazals are clearly distinguished from the mutafarriqat, scattered single Beyts. In the 30 years plus that I have been wending my way through Sā'eb's vast corpus of 7,000 Ghazals, I have also found that most of them revolve around some identifiable topic or image, often stated in the opening line. To resolve this dilemma, for me to have it both ways, I will propose a way of looking at the relationship of part and whole, of Beit and Ghazal, that conceives of the whole not as a totalizing unity, but as an assemblage, an arrangement of self-subsistent parts. But before I do, let's get in a time machine and go back to the 1990s and to the article by Fran Pritchett that I mentioned earlier. Orient Pearls Unstrung, the quest for unity in the Ghazal, as this article is entitled, argues that the quest for unity is a quest for an illusion, a search for a unicorn, a chimera that exists only in the mind of Western readers and scholars. She rightly points out that unity seekers have used a bewildering variety of criteria to establish unity. Theme, tone, association of ideas, imagery, syntactic patterning, sound play, and so forth. Do all these criteria need to be fulfilled for a Ghazal to be unified? If not, which ones? If unity can take on so many different forms, we can justifiably ask whether it exists at all. And Fran concludes that it doesn't. Individual Beyts stand on their own as independent poems. In support of this conclusion, she points out that the sequence of verses in a Ghazal is often variable, and verses can be added and removed. Biographical anthologies, Tazkires, typically cite single Beyts, not full Ghazals. Moreover, the native critical tradition produced a sophisticated vocabulary for analyzing the figures of speech and thought in the individual verse, and appears to lack a comparable analytical tools for the Ghazal. Fran does not shy away from the full implications of her argument. The Ghazal has no status as an artistic whole and is not a valid unit for analysis. The strictly formal feature of rhyme merely provides a quote-unquote showcase for the display of an aggregation of otherwise unrelated short poems. Fran Pritchett's critique of the idea of unity and the evidence that she presents are persuasive in many ways. Any effort to revive the ontological and critical status of the Ghazal will have to respect the self-subsistence of the Beyt and to account for the fact that verses may or may not hang together and may move into, out of, and around the Ghazal. But her argument also has its shortcomings. It relies heavily on a modern performance practice, the Musha'ere, or poetic competitions at which Urdu poets present their Ghazals. These competitions are highly interactive oral performances. The poet will present a single verse, then pause, waiting for the audience's reaction. Depending on the response, the poet might well repeat the verse or move on to another verse more in keeping with the audience's mood. The poet can change the number and order of the verses vis-a-vis the written text, provided that a written text exists at all. I have never attended a Musha'era and have a limited knowledge of Urdu, but other scholars have confirmed the accuracy of this description of the Musha'era, and it jives with my own impression of the Urdu Ghazal in translation. But to use a modern practice to define, quote, the true nature of the Ghazal, close quote, risks anachronistic essentialism. There is no reason to believe that modern performance practice definitively represents a literary form cultivated in numerous languages over the course of 14 centuries. Just within the Persian tradition, a Ghazal by Sana'i from the 11th century and one by Sā'eb from the 17th call for very different kinds of reading and were likely presented to their audiences in very different ways. The Ghazal is no more immune to historical change than any other social institution or discourse, and essentialist definitions stymie efforts to account for such changes. In the course of the article, Fran acknowledges that there are many exceptions to her theory. In some Ghazals, for example, rhyme is not just a formal feature, but carries a semantic load that shapes each verse. She concedes that there are even ghazals on a single theme and ghazals that, quote, exhibit the strongest kinds of sequential, integral, organic unity, close quote. As these exceptions pile up, the atomist approach begins to seem as problematic as the quest for unity. So, and in case, these were all friends from the 90s, so using first names is my effort to kind of get that, but anyway. At the same time that Fran Pritchett was laying out the basis for today's consensus on the disunity of the Ghazal based on the Urdu tradition, scholars working in Persian were doggedly pursuing more precise ways of talking just about this, about unity. Frank Lewis's groundbreaking dissertation on Sana'i, a founding figure in the Persian Ghazal tradition, appeared in 1995. It traces the historical emergence of the form and analyzes 50 of Sana'i's Ghazals in very close detail. Frank shows how the Ghazal form came to accommodate not just individual Beyts, but Beyts linked by common themes, such as wine, the pleasures and pains of love, complaint, description of the beloved, panegyric, asceticism, and so on and so forth. These close readings are enacted in boldly innovative and effective translations, giving, if you will, performative evidence to the integrity of the whole poem. Julie Scott Maysami, whose recent death should also be remembered here today, was working along much the same lines at the same time. In a series of articles culminating in her book Structure and Meaning in Medieval Arabic and Persian Poetry, published in 2003, Maysami argues, contrary to Pritchett, that the native critical tradition did in fact have ways talking about poetic units beyond the verse. The category of gharaz, plural agraz, organizes poetry and other forms of discourse according to rhetorical intention or purpose. Common agraz, or purposes as I'll call them today, include mat, praise, heja, lampoon, vasf, description, taghazul, amorous appeal, and hekmat, gnomic or wisdom teachings. Gharaz is an open-ended category, and the purpose of the Ghazal is sometimes defined in very specific detail. In his ostensibly autobiographical account of his love affair with a high-class courtesan, the Safavid poet Muhtasham Kashani, who died in 1588, explains the intentions behind the poems that he wrote over the course of this relationship. Now, some of these intentions include standard gharaz, such as supplication, du'a, apology, ma'zarat, and complaint, shekayat. But there are also purposes of what we might call purposes of the moment, such as increasing jealousy is one of the poem's purposes, ghayrat afza'i, or listing the reasons for regret, fehreste abvav pashimoni ha. This is only one example of poets, if not critics, talking about the ways a Ghazal can or should hang together. For Frank and Julie, theme and purpose offer strong proof of the unity of the Ghazal. So here we are 30 years on, and this debate has pretty much disappeared. We are left with two diametrically opposed consensuses, each supported by scholars and colleagues whom I knew well and respected and admired. There seems to be no middle ground, no way of talking about the Ghazal that can account for both an Urdu Ghazal of the 18th century and a Persian Ghazal of the 11th. Taking Pritchett's critique in a different direction, I think that the problem lies in the concept of unity itself. From Hegel and the Enlightenment on, unity has meant organic unity. In the organicist version of the relationship of part and whole, the whole is a totalizing structure that defines each of its parts. In the words of Manuel de Landa, quote, a part detached from such a whole ceases to be what it is, since being this particular part is one of its constitutive properties. A whole in which the component parts are self-subsistent and their relationships external to each other does not possess organic unity, close quote. To take an obvious example, if you remove the liver from a body, it becomes a piece of meat, and the body disintegrates. Or less obviously, think of a jigsaw puzzle. The picture determines the appearance of the pieces, and the pieces exist only to make the picture. A place for everything and everything in its place. This is a test that most Ghazals cannot pass. Manuscripts of many of the most renowned Ghazal writers show significant variations in verse order and sequence with Beyts removed, replaced, and rearranged. Nevertheless, these verses often coalesce around a common theme or purpose in a single artistic statement, but in ways much looser and more flexible than totalizing organic unity allows for. Organic unity, however, is not the only way of thinking about the relationship of part and whole. In their campaign against all forms of totalizing and totalitarian thinking, the philosopher-psychiatrist tag team of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari have proposed a model that has come to be known in English as assemblage, though arrangement might be a better translation of the French term agencement. Let's start with a rousing passage from their book Anti-Oedipus. We no longer believe in the primordial totality. We believe only in totalities that are peripheral. And if we discover such a totality alongside separate parts, it is a whole of these particular parts, but does not totalize them. It is a unity of all those particular parts, but does not unify them. Rather, it is added to them as a new part, fabricated separately. Did you find that rousing? Anyway. But anyway, let me try and unpack this passage in plainer and less rhetorically charged language. In assemblage theory, the parts are themselves self-subsistent, heterogeneous wholes that nevertheless have the capacity to enter into relation with other self-subsistent parts. Rather than the whole determining the nature of the parts, it is the parts that determine the nature of the whole. The whole emerges only from the interactions and interrelations between the parts, or equally, the lack of such interactions. Parts can be added or removed without losing their internal integrity. The nature of the whole can change without collapsing. This idea is not as exotic as it sounds. Most human organizations work like this. Take, for example, the modest example of a reading group. The book under discussion provides a context for the assemblage of heterogeneous readers, each with a self-subsistent identity outside of the group. Over the weeks, the group and discussion coalesce. If someone should be absent for a week, relations between the member parts will shift, but the whole remains intact. Or we can contrast the unity of the jigsaw puzzle, as Deleuze and Guattari do, to the assemblage of the dry stone fence or wall. Or consider collages of calligraphic clippings. Or the shadow boxes of Joseph Cornell. By the way, you can go and see the owl, at your very own art institute, where they have a spectacular exhibit of these Cornell things. So the elements of assemblage theory have been elaborated in sometimes excruciating detail in sociology, politics, and human geography. But what interests me today is how assemblage theory might work for the Ghazal and what problems it might help us solve. There are three essential elements to my application of this theory to the Ghazal. First is a territory, a framework that establishes a field of potential relations. Think of the book in the book club. In the Ghazal, territory is established by rhyme and meter. Rhyme is primarily a matter of sound, of sonic materiality, but it can also be semantically expressive. Territory is also established by the first and final lines of the Ghazal, the two parts that are defined by their role in the whole. Internal rhyme marks the matla, the opening verse, as the beginning of the poem, and the poet's name marks the maqta as the end. The second element is the Beyts that make up the body of the Ghazal. These verses, again, are heterogeneous and self-subsistent. There we go. But they all have the potential to enter into various relations with other verses. We can even call these Beyts atoms and molecules, as long as we remember that it is in the nature of atoms and molecules to form, break, and reform bonds. Something that gets left out when they talk about atomistic theory. The final and third element is what I will call parameters of coherence. If someone has a better option, let me know. Parameters of coherence. These are the factors that can serve to either pull the parts together or conversely push them apart. These parameters can take different forms: purpose, theme, imagery, sound, tone, rhetorical stance, and so forth, and may vary in strength and scope. The relevant parameters will only emerge as the parts interact and form or do not form networks of relation. Think of these parameters as regulatory dials that can be turned up or down to create greater or lesser coherence between the Beyts. These parameters will change not only from Ghazal to Ghazal, but from historical period to historical period, and I dare say from poet to poet. Assemblage theory helps resolve the binary of the atomists and the unifiers by allowing for variability in the degree of coherence in any given Ghazal. It accounts for the fact that Beyts shift position and come in and out of the Ghazal, altering without necessarily destroying the integrity of the whole. To return to Deleuze and Guattari's paradoxical phrase, assemblage creates a unity of particular parts but does not unify them. Assemblage gives us a way to account for historical change, for differences between a Persian Ghazal of the 11th century and an Urdu Ghazal of the 18th. It also is perhaps the openness of this whole made of wholes that accounts for the remarkable longevity and proliferation of the Ghazal form. Viewing the Ghazal as assemblage also allows me to have it both ways, to take both Sā'eb's single verses and his Ghazals as legitimate units of analysis and interpretation. So to put these ideas to work, we can look at one of Sā'eb's most celebrated and frequently anthologized Ghazals. This poem contains some of Sā'eb's best-known Beyts, single verses that have taken on a life of their own outside of the context of the poem. I've examined 8 versions of this poem in various editions and anthologies. The longest version contains 12 Beyts, but the others range in length from 6 to 10 Beyts in various sequences. This Ghazal certainly challenges any notion of organic unity, but it also shows how a coherent whole, a unity that does not unify, can emerge from the assemblage of parts. So the first and final Beyts, which you have before you here, the matla and the maqta, are essential markers of territory in any Ghazal. The first with its internal rhyme, which you'll hear in a moment, and the final with its citation of the poet's pen name. با کمال احتیاج از خلق استغنا خوش است. با دهان خشک مردن در لب دریا خوش است. In direst need, this is the opening verse, in direst need, it is good to hold people in disdain. With parched lips, it is good to die at the edge of the sea. هیچ کاری بی تأمل گرچه صایب خوب نیست، بی تأمل آستین افشاندن از دنیا خوش است. Though no task comes out well, Sā'eb, without careful thought, waving off the world without a care is good. So the first verse then establishes the rhyme, a force of formal cohesion that runs throughout the poem. The repeated refrain, or radif, خوش است, it is good, makes the rhyme especially noticeable and gives sonic cohesion, and expressive coherence. This radif has a long history, goes back to Attar and Hafez, and it implies that every verse will somehow answer the question, what is good? These opening and concluding verses offer similar answers. What is good are self-sufficiency and independence from the people and the world and its people. Such existential maxims belong to one of the traditional purposes, gharaz, or thematic genres of Persian literature, which we can call either hekmat or nasihat, either wisdom or advice. Rhyme, together with the framing verses, establish a field of potential relations between the self-subsistent parts in every ghazal. But here, these framing devices also suggest a thematic pattern of coherence, i.e. the gharaz. Before delving into the relations that develop in the middle of the poem, however, I'd like to look more closely at the first bait. Despite its key structural role in this ghazal, this matla that you have before you, also stands on its own as a coherent poetic statement, engaging the reader's powers of metaphorical and analogical thinking. It uses one of Sā'eb's favorite rhetorical vices called tamsil, in which an abstract claim is put forward in one half of the verse and is demonstrated analogically by a concrete exemplum in the other half. The exemplum here, a person dying of thirst on the beach, is dramatic and attention-grabbing. But how exactly does it serve to confirm the claim made in the first half of the verse? What is the analogy that holds disdain and death as equivalent and equally good? Unusually, we can look at the following bait for an answer. And so you'll see I've added a verse there. نیست پروا و تلخکامانان ز تلخی‌های عشق آب دریا در مذاق ماهی دریا خوش است. The embittered don't mind the bitterness of love. To the palate of the fish in the sea, salt water tastes good. While this verse does not, strictly speaking, form part of the territorial frame of this ghazal, it appears in all 8 versions of the poem that I looked at, and it's always in this second position. Lexical repetition of the rhyme word darya firmly links it to the first verse. Moreover, by emphasizing the bitter salinity of seawater, this bait provides a clue for unpacking the analogy in the opening tamsil. To a person with parched lips, seawater looks as though it can quench the thirst, but drinking it will only make one's suffering worse. So too, people look as though they can help, but they will only make our problems worse. But the second verse also presents a rebuttal to the first. Bitter disappointment in love and the suffering and self-reckoning that they entail can prepare us for life's other hardships. Metaphorically speaking, they can make even salt water palatable. It is as though the phrase, on the other hand, appears between these first 2 verses. This kind of dialogical relation acts as a cohesive force in many of Sā'eb's ghazals. Either of these 2 verses can stand on their own as independent utterances, but to read them together is good. They're self-subsistent. Self-subsistence does not prevent them from entering into meaningful relation with one another. But the relations between other verses need not be so close. Remember, the whole is not a totalizing structure, and it emerges gradually through the dynamics of relation, be those relations strong, weak, or even non-existent. The different versions of this ghazal contain from 3 to 9 other additional Beyts that come in no particular order. We might think of the territory of this ghazal as a kind of open house. The first 2 verses are the gently arguing host couple, and the final verse, their self-reflective friend and co-host. Other verses are the guests who drop in and out randomly, but 2 of them arrive early and stay late. The following 2 verses appear in every version of the poem that I have examined. بقر در خرمن مردم تماشا کرده است آن که پندارد که حال مردم دنیا خوش است فکرشم به تخت دارد جمعه اطفال را اشرت امروز بی اندیشه فردا خوش است. If he fancies that the lives of the worldly are good, has he ever seen lightning strike people's harvests? The thought of Monday makes the children's Sunday bitter. Without the thought of tomorrow, the pleasure of today is good. So both of these verses fall within the ample parameter of hekmat, the gharaz, or purpose, established by the frame. In the first of these two Beyts, the repeated word mardum is semantically related to khalq in our opening ma'la, if you can remember. The rhetorical question helps explain why relying on people is a bad idea. Their lives, too, are subject to uncertainty and devastation. The second of these Beyts, one of my favorite, by the way, the second of these Beyts is often quoted in isolation as another example of Sā'eb's mastery of tamsil. And again, this particular rhetorical pattern, again, takes us back to the opening verse. And there's a repetition of talq, bitter, which again establishes relation with that second verse. Even within this field of relations, however, the image of children fretting over the start of the school week expands the scope of the whole. It perhaps suggests that focus on the present moment offers one way of escaping the norms of society, and it kind of looks forward to that kind of carefree, wave it off attitude of the signature verse. Let's add one more verse that appears in all but one of the 8 versions. هرچه رفت از عمر یاد آن به نیکی می کنند چهره امروز در آینه فردا خوش است. So adding that additional verse, people remember for the best the life they lived in the past. The face of today looks good in the mirror of tomorrow. So again, we have repeated rhyme. Farda appears in both of these verses, tomorrow, and it puts them into a strong relation. Whether they appear sequentially or not in the course of any version of this poem, both of these verses deal with our perception of time. But while the school children look ahead and spoil their weekend, here people look back in time with a soothing nostalgia. We are advised to imagine ourselves in the future, looking back at today with the same nostalgia. One verse tells us to seize the day, while the other reminds us that this too shall pass, in a dialogical relation similar to that between the first two verses of the poem. So we could go on adding verses and moving them around. There is no totalizing unity to close off the open borders of this particular territory. Our sense of the coherence of the whole instead emerges as each self-subsistent part enters into relation with the others. Several fluctuating parameters shape this coherence. The most important here is the capacious thematic genre or gharaz of hekmat. But parameters of word choice, lexical repetition, semantic echo, rhetoric, syntax, and dialectic are also brought into play. We might think of these various versions as performances of the same poem. as long as we don't assume the existence of some underlying text, some stable text behind these performances. This poem in its different enactments is, to use another of Deleuze and Guattari's paradoxical formulations, a quote-unquote fragmentary whole. To explore this idea of dialogical coherence a little further, let's turn to another one of Sā'eb's well-known Ghazals. It is a remarkably stable text. Compared to the one we just looked at, this is an editor's wonder. In all the versions that I've tracked down, the poem is always exactly 7 verses long, and the verses always appear in exactly the same order. Right? It opens with another striking use of tamsil, or analogy. Adame pir cho shod hers javan migardad. Khab dar vaqt sahargah giran migardad. Greed gets younger as one grows older. The deepest sleep is just before the dawn. This compact one-verse poem again calls on the reader to unpack a complex analogy. Greed and ethical torpor aligns with sleep, easy enough. Old age must then be like the hours just before dawn. But the basis for this second comparison lies in another metaphor nowhere explicitly stated in the text. Death is like the dawn, the time when we awaken from our mortal corporeal existence. Detecting the coherence in this bait requires the reader's interpretation, similar to the process that we use when we detect kind of the coherence of an entire Ghazal. A reader may be inclined to categorize this verse as yet another example of the thematic genre of hekmat, of wisdom. But genre and purpose, again, emerge only as the parameters of coherence develop in relation with other verses in relation. And the next 2 verses point us in a different kind of direction, right? So, Asman dar harakat az nazar roshan mast. آب از قوت سرچشمه دوان می‌گردد. رأی روشن ز بزرگان کهنسال طلب. آبها صاف در ایام خزان می‌گردد. Our luminous gaze sets the heavens in motion. The force of the spring drives the flow of the stream. Pools of water turn limpid in autumn. For lucid counsel, look to honored elders. So these second and third verses are again related on a lexical level. Ab, the word water, appears in both, as does the word roshan, luminous or lucid, as I translate it here. The third verse can be read as a kind of hekmat. It's another kind of tamsil. But the ma, the we or our, in the second verse is completely foreign to this kind of dispersonalized gnomic teaching. Indeed, our luminous gaze, nazar roshan ma, sounds much more like boasting, like fakhra, than it does like hekmat or wisdom. And wait, isn't the teaching in the third verse exactly the opposite of the opening verse? In the matla, old age is metaphorically equated with ethical turpitude. Here, old age is acquainted with mental lucidity. The semantic relationship between pir in verse 1 and kohansal in verse 3, in fact, point us toward another established, though less common, thematic genre, shoyuchiyat, poems on the subject of old age. As I suggested earlier, the open variability of assemblage gives us a way to talk about historical change in the Ghazal. It also gives us a way to talk about the differences between particular poets. Sā'eb led an extraordinarily long life, living into his late 80s or early 90s. And not surprisingly, he wrote many poems on aging, and they happened to show him at the height of his artistic power. We should not be surprised that meditation, ta'ammul, on old age emerges as the dominant cohesive pattern by the third verse. After looking at the previous poem, neither should we be surprised that this theme is handled dialogically. Dialectical relation is a frequent parameter of coherence in Sā'eb's poetry, ironically enough. This is not a claim about the Ghazal in general or the Ghazal in this period. It is a claim about Sā'eb and one of the infinite ways of putting verses in relation that he particularly favored. Time will not allow me to present the rest of this poem in detail, so I'm going to offer you a full translation, including the second half. Frank and I spent hours talking about translation. He was always a bolder translator than I am, and I learned over the years so much from his practice. What I admire most about his translations of the Ghazals of Sana'i and Rumi is how they bring to the fore the interpretive nature of translation. Reliably accurate to the source text, his translations also enact a reading of the text in dialogue with the expectations of the receiving culture, in dialogue with the Anglo-American modernist tradition. In this translation, I timidly use stanza breaks to bring out the contour of the whole. The beginning of each verse in Persian is indicated by a bold initial. So from the top, greed gets younger as one grows older. The deepest sleep is just before the dawn. Our luminous gaze sets the heavens in motion. The force of the spring drives the flow of the stream. Pools of water turn limpid in autumn. For lucid counsel, look to honored elders. Secluded retirement is a snare laid in the dust to catch public acclaim. Wine grows stronger as it grows older. The levels of love ascend gradually. Freed of rancor, such folk walk the heavens like dusty roads. The wolf of this flock can watch over the lamb. One who can't handle the blade of the tongue, Sā'eb, will be slain at last by this sword. So, the second half of this poem, beginning with secluded retirement, verses 4 through 6, follows the same dialogical pattern as the first half. Secluded retirement is a mockery of the spiritual maturity that we associate with the elders. Another direct reference to aging, this time of wine rather than people, initiates a counter movement to a community of the wise, the honored elders, nurtured in love, walking the celestial highway as though it were a country lane. The final verse seems to break, as it often does, from the body of the poem. We can take this maqta, this final line, as a self-standing bit of practical advice. Don't talk so loosely that you commit linguistic hara-kiri. But the word tongue also suggests a way of reading this verse in relation to the body of the poem. Signature verses often take a metapoetic turn, commenting in some way or another on the poem that's just being concluded. The critical and monetary tone of this particular signature verse may be aimed at the speaker, at Sā'eb, and at the dialectical relations we've just discussed. Sā'eb expresses two diametrically opposed perspectives with equal concision and effective force. If the sword of Sā'eb's tongue can cut both ways, it can also rebound to strike him, to undercut his authority as a poet. This would hardly be the only instance of Sā'eb ending a ghazal with self-directed critique. So I'm giving most of my attention today to the seemingly paradoxical use of dialectic as a parameter of coherence. We've also seen other parameters at work: lexical, semantic, rhetorical, and above all, purpose and theme. Fran Pritchett is right to object that so many different ways of defining unity undermine the very concept of unity. But multiple lines of relation along different parameters is exactly what we would expect in an assemblage. The dials of these parameters can be turned up or down, and the self-subsistent parts may cohere tightly, loosely, or really not very much at all. So yes, the whole emerges from these various kinds of parameters, or not, in a particular ghazal or thematic genre, or even a combination of genres, a topic I can't really even go into today. Robert Rader, going back to the old days, Robert Rader in 1974 wrote that every ghazal has the unity of, quote, of being the particular poem which it is, close quote. This is not as tautological as it sounds. The network of relations is open-ended, and each particular whole will emerge in its own way, depending on the nature of the parts and the parameters in play. Let me end with one last example. Among the wide range of established agraz, or purposes, we focus today on kind of the more discursive varieties, hekmat and ta'ammul, which are by definition very open categories. But Sā'eb wrote poems in most other recognized thematic genres as well. Love poems, poems of regret. He writes a great poem on going deaf. And sometimes his theme is kind of unmistakable, but it's really hard to pin down in one of these conventional topical categories. So, as in this particular poem, Yade Ayomi ki ba ham ashna budim ma, ham khayal o ham safir o ham nawa budim ma. The memory of days when we were familiar with one another. We imagined together, whistled together, and sang together. The radif, the rhyming refrain, budim ma, couldn't be much simpler. We were. The pronoun ma in Persian has lots of uses. The imperial we, the deferential we, the collective we, but the repeated particle here, ham, indicates reciprocity and singles out the sense of we as you and me. By Sā'eb's standards, the syntax and rhetoric of the verse are simple. As in the first poem we examined, verses in the body of this poem too can come and go and change order in various manuscripts. But unlike our first case, this variability here does not open a space for dialogue. Instead, all the dials of the parameters of coherence are turned to 11. They are turned up high. The words yak, one, or ettihad, union, concord, appear in every bait. Each individual verse is syntactically independent, but all contribute to a common theme and tone, a wistful remembrance of a friendship now in the past. We can legitimately make statements about the nature of this friendship based on the whole of the ghazal. It was a friendship based on kinship of spirit and not amorous affection. Images of music, writing, and poetry suggest a shared involvement in the arts that goes back to the time of youth and survived many long separations. My translation, accordingly, eschews any breaks between the Persian Beyts. And I dedicate this translation to the friend and colleague that we are here to honor today, Frank Lewis. Recall the days when we were close, whistling together and singing, our imaginations in tune. We were like the sense of a verse, though we seemed separate words. In concord, our meaning was one. Although to superficialize, we were two, like the split nib of a pen, our words were one. Like two green leaves emerging from a single seed, we grew up looking alike and one at heart. Like drops of dew, our eyes grazed on the same roses. We measured our song in one garden bower. Distant residence was no veil to our oneness. Wherever we were, we knew one another's news. Our star was auspicious, our fate happy, and happily we sheltered beneath the wings of one bird of good omen. Sā'eb, we never bothered the solicitous. We were the cure for one another's old pains. I thank you for your time and patience. And since Frank's not among us to point out all my oversights and oversimplifications, that's your job.
So I will start with selfishly with a question for me, then open the floor, and then we'll take questions also from the audience on Zoom. Thank you. Yeah. So first of all, not that it really matters, but how can I say? It's not only, I mean, saying that I agree would mean nothing. It's just that what you presented here, I really see as an invitation to enter the world of the poem in ways that other things that I've read on either the unity or atomic or atomistic, not atomic, atomistic approach to the poem really don't have this effect on me, if I may say. And that's actually my question has to do with that, with something that, as such, I don't recall really seeing. I mean, being reviewed in those debates. Which is, and maybe it has some echoes with friend Pritchett's take with the Mushaira, taking the Mushaira as a point of entry to deal with that. But it is the question of the nocte and the punctum and the relative poetic density and how this plays out. In the kind of relationships that you were showing, because here, and again, very convincingly, you showed the motion between the Beyts, the structure, the symmetries, the semantic symmetries, how and how this also is. I mean, it creates a motion in the mind of the reader and indeed on the page, because we see the verses move from one recension to another, etc. So I was wondering just if you had some thoughts, some comments on this question of the relative poetic density of the verses and how this plays out in what you just told us. And for instance, a very last thing. You know, the question of tazkiras and the selection of verses. The more I read tazkiras, the more I feel that the Ghazal is present as a ghost somehow around the verses that are there. And as we all know, a good tazkira is done by someone who has read the divans, not by someone who has read other tazkiras. And so I'm just throwing those thoughts at you, and I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, sure. So let's take that 11th century Ghazal by Sana'i, and let's take a Ghazal from the 17th century by Sā'eb. The Sana'i Ghazals, you really just don't have a question that they're dealing with a single theme, right? And the verses really kind of will all push in that direction. They also tend to be, in terms of rhetorical devices like we get later, they also tend to be much simpler, right? There's a much more kind of straightforward quality to the language. You don't get tied up in working out metaphors and this and that. As that rhetorical complexity in the line, and boy am I talking off the top of my head, but as the rhetorical intensity of the line becomes more evident as you move into the 16th and 17th centuries, and actually I could even contrast just the 16th and 17th centuries, unity tends to become more under pressure, right? Because each part is doing so much more, or trying to do so much more. There's a tendency to just shove as much stuff into the single bait. So I think that's part of what leads to this kind of loosening of the ghosting, if you will, of the Ghazal, is the fact that, like I say, this ramp up the rhetoric within a single verse, and it tends to have the effect of shoving it a little bit apart from the other verses, right? On the other hand, a phrase, how many times did I have to count the number of times I used that in the talk. On the other hand, it remains when you have a poet like Sā'eb, and I would say Taleb al-Mawli is also the same kind of way. When you have poets like that who really are, to my reading, very conscious of making an artistic statement over the course of an entire ghazal, that double density, if you will, is part of what I think makes these poems so spectacular, because there's a ton of stuff going on within each individual part. And then through repetition of rhyme words, through semantic echoes, through paralleling rhetorical devices, you get that second layer of complexity thrown onto the first. And I think that's what makes a lot of this poetry from the end of the 17th century so daunting. And why it's so easy to lose track of, oh wait, this is a poem about deafness, right? Because you've just gone through how many variations on the Persian idiom sangush, stone-eared. It's a common way of talking about deafness in Persian. And he's run every kind of imaginative game on that phrase that you can imagine. And it's only when you kind of take a deep breath at the end of the poem and go, wait, all of these things are about going deaf. And similarly with other themes. It's just a poem, but. So does that get to your question? Cool. And thank you, by the way, for the kind words.
Thank you so much for this very sensitive reading and wonderful translations. I really have two comments or questions. The first is, so this is a ghazal which has one theme, right? But a ghazal has one theme, but I assume that this would also apply to a qasida, because a qasida, I mean, in the Arabic tradition, I'm not sure in the Persian, but at least in the Arabic tradition, there's many movements, as James Montgomery has it. So,
sure, great. Do you have another question, or can I answer that one?
How would you like?
Even if you have another question, I'm going to answer that one. And then you can ask your other question. Yeah, that's the topic that I couldn't get into today, because what we might call mixed agraz or mixed thematic ghazals are very common. You can, usually again, you can mark, just like as in a qasida, you can mark where the change is. There'll be some point around, usually around the middle of the poem, where all of a sudden I've gone from sort of trying to convince my beloved that I'm worth, I'm worth some shadow of her love. That's the first three verses. Last four verses, life is hard. Life is really hard. Something like that. And that's actually a very common movement. That's a movement that you find in Hafez's ghazals. Jami makes almost a rule out of it. So you do have those mixed things. And I guess what I would suggest, and certainly the qasida, even longer poems can have this kind of mixture of thematic genres that hold to that structure the thing. But yeah, I just didn't. I already took 50 minutes of your time. so
therefore, assemblage can apply to that too, because it's still a unity despite disparate nature of the movements.
Right. Or it's not a unity, but it's a whole.
Right. So my second point actually.
My war on. Do you notice the slide? I thought it was okay. What is unity? Right. A conceptual stumbling block? I thought that was really, that was a good Zoom moment. Anyway, go ahead.
My second point actually relates to what you said of Friend Pritchard's critique of the definition of unity as having so many meanings as to make it meaningless. So, I mean, the whole point about assemblage is that it can incorporate almost anything. So, would the same critique apply, do you think, to assemblage being so expansive as a notion?
Right. Yes, I mean, this is both a drawback. I mean, the beauty of, and why I'm on a war against the word unity, I really want to talk about wholes, right? And as I kept trying to say all the way through, or not. They may connect or not. The bonds may be strong, loose, or non-existent, right? This is a model that I hope gives me both ends of the spectrum. I can give you another poet from the period that I study, Shaukat Bukharai. And his poems are one topic in one verse, another topic in another verse. He's talking to one person in one verse, somebody different in another. They're as scattered as anything that I have seen in Urdu. Assemblage says, yeah, that's possible. And again, go back to the reading group. I really like the human kind of analogies for this. You can have a reading group which never takes off. Nobody talks to each other. They're all in the same room, and the thing usually peters out after about 4 or 5 weeks, and everybody goes, God, that was miserable. That's an assemblage. It's just an assemblage that went a different way, right? I may be a little too Deleuzian in all of this, but variability is good. Why does everything have to hang together? Some things don't, but there they are. They all seem to be in the same place. So that's what I would say. I mean, I don't, and the other thing that I think this gives me is that the parameters, if you will, are built into this model, right? So I'm not saying unity is one thing, unity is another thing, unity is a third thing. I'm saying that it can be any of these things, right? So that instability, that variability, if you will, is I hope built into the system. I mean, is that? Okay.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk, inspiring, and beautiful, beautiful translations. I was wondering, you talked about matla and maqta, and then I was thinking about the pearls on strong. And then I was thinking, is it safe to say that, so the Beyts of a Ghazal are like on a thread, and the thread being the radif and the qafiyah, because that is what holds everything together. And then from this end to the other end are two ties. One is matla, one is maqta, so you can't move them. But whatever is in between is like beads that could be smaller or bigger, and then that's why they can move along.
Right. That's why I back away from pearls, because I want a necklace that has lots of different stones. Maybe they're all pearls if you've got time on your hand, and but maybe they're not. Maybe one's a pearl, one's a glass bead, one's an emerald. I mean, you can do, yeah. So as long as that, I mean, I think that's useful. And then I want to make sure that you can untie the ends when you get bored, and then put stones back in a new order. So yeah, but I mean, I think that's it. And again, I would kind of play with that metaphor a little bit more.
Yes, I'm coming from another discipline, like another language. So for me, this was very interesting, entertaining, and inspiring, especially the side of translation. So my question would be, about the technique of translation, because thinking of this type of, coexisting parts, assemblage, you have tones, you have rhymes. How hard do you try to kind of express it in English? Because English is coming with another word order, another structure. How do you manage, to
Well,
do
I
the
always try. How well I succeed. The technique in this one, I'll just use this one as an example that is kind of handy. So let's call this the old people are wise point of view in these two long stanzas. The speaker in these, he loves the sound l. Luminous, pools, flow, limpid, lucid, look, elders, and I keep it down here. Levels of love. Oh, there's the L one. Flock, lamb, right? And so what I tried to do in this one was kind of give some of that sense by using alliteration. There are, except for laid, I don't think, any other, sleep, we do have sleep, but this is actually, this line I worked on hard because I wanted to get the kind of axiomatic, the sort of proverbial sense. So I got greed gets grows. So I do try and pull those things out in translation. Again, I like my translations to respond to each poem in ways that kind of grow out of the poem, rather than me going, oh God, I really wish I could rhyme better. I can, but all my rhymes are like limericks. It means they usually have dirty words in them, but anyway, so I hope that answers your question.
You talked, like this poem had examples of, the previous one had examples of contradictory ideas that you end up holding in your mind at the same time, and then the very last line, critiquing oneself as a poet. Did those tendencies in the content of poems come as a response to crisper final messages that did not capture like the complexity of the world? And
right,
like to you,
yes. Yes, okay. If I can just stop you right there. Yes, okay. This is 17th century. This is the Baroque. This is where we're questioning forms, we're putting contradictions together. It is the mental landscape that poets like Sā'eb worked in. And yeah, this is all totally intentional. And I don't want to say thought out, because poetry is usually more intuitive than that. But yes, thinking in contradiction. That was one of the things they love to do, and God love them for it. I mean, it's part of what makes that particular poetry resonate with us today, because this is not a simple world that they're living in, either politically, socially, or in terms of the mental landscape. And so this kind of dialectic thing is not exclusive to poetry by any stretch of the imagination.
Is that necessarily spiritual to you, and just as a general phenomenon? I was just curious about that.
Well, spiritual. Okay, and I didn't mean that to carry any sound like we're, but no, it's a hard word to maneuver in this kind of world. Because yes, I mean, I think there's this, obviously this is one of these poems, if you look closely, there are tons of little Sufi images and word choices that kind of run through this poem. But I think this is really, let me put it this way. We tend these days to have rationality over here, the very orderly left half of my brain, and imagination and things like that, and emotions over here, right? That's there's a lot of ways you put it, ego, blah, 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 blah. These people didn't work that way, right? This was a period where really emotion was subject to rational thought, right? You could think through the way you feel. And so it's T.S. Eliot's famous phrase for when this happened is the dissociation of sensibility, where mind went this way, feelings went that way, heart went that way. This is before the dissociation of sensibility. This is when there was when heart and head were kind of on speaking terms. Not that they always got along, but they were on speaking terms.
I have a more practical question, actually.
Sure.
Just because I've always admired these poems. I've had a chance to even listen and work with somebody like Coleman Barks or Kabir Helminski, and reading these different translations, Edward Fitzgerald, Omar Khayyam, and they've given me a portal into that. But sometimes, not knowing the language, but knowing some of the language has helped me understand, like, I wouldn't have translated it that way, or I wouldn't see it that way. And as someone who does do a lot of that sometimes, from Arabic to English, or just to explain things as well, or or in music for that matter. Do you have any practical advice on how to translate something like this? What are just
Okay,
something?
I'm gonna recommend something that you would never hear from Fitzgerald, certainly never from Coleman Barks.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is that one of the things, when I get myself really knotted into, and as you can imagine, that happens with these with these kinds of verses. You get very knotted into things. And one of the things, I mean, in terms of practical advice, I give it my best shot. I give it sometimes start with a prose version, then start kind of thinking about where line breaks might fall and how the rhythm might work. I then shove it in a drawer, bring it out a week later, sometimes more, sometimes less, read it again, and then I go back to the source. I go back to the original text. And it is amazing at the end of that process how many of my problems are solved by reading Persian. All of a sudden it's just like, okay, yeah, no, why was I messing around with all of this when this sits here perfectly in the Persian if I just don't monkey it up? So there's practical advice, which is, because translation is such a variable thing and it comes out so many different ways, if you're a good translator or a practice translator, you'll have that go on in your head. You won't need other people to give you different versions. You'll come up with enough versions on your own. And the best thing really, to me, is just kind of maintaining that dialogue, that back and forth between the translated text and the source that it comes from. I guess that's what I would say in terms of my practice as a translator.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is over in the translation corner. So,
I'm going to come over and, can I move and still be heard? Okay.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned assemblage theory,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, it kind of takes many forms, different flavors in different disciplines. Right. But I'm interested to hear where you feel that the process of translation itself fits into assemblage, and like if it is part of that assemblage. In other iterations of assemblage theory, like it kind of takes on this really organic environment that encapsulates all processes and productions that are part of the
you
the
know your
thing itself.
Deleuze.
But I think it would be really interesting to hear, like, if you feel that your translations are part of that, not just in a dialogue, but in this really constitutive space.
Oh yeah.
That is like part of the assemblage itself.
Okay, so let me break your question into two parts. Right. So the first part is what I talked about today. So these breaks and indentations and this kind of stuff is because of the way that I thought the poem was assembled, right? How these pieces were arranged. And so I wanted to, and I intervened, right? I put breaks here, I shoved two lines together here and here. And so all of that was due to this kind of sense of how this poem is put together. Now the second part of your question, I think, was what does it tell me, what does it tell us or tell me about the way I translate? Right? So that's a different question. One that I don't have an answer for. No, let me try. I think that I'm totally into flow, if that doesn't sound too new agey. My poet is totally into flow. He is what I've taken to calling a water poet. Images of water. And we've already, without me even looking, we've had images of water in both of the poems that we looked at, or in the first two poems that we looked at. So that said, I do think that there's a sense in which there's a mental process, like I was just describing, right? There's where I have many little translation demons who all reside between my ears. right? And they come up with all kinds of clever and not so clever ideas. And they yell, you know, and there are all these kind of pressures, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. And so there is this kind of eventual sort of, what do I want to call it? Maybe to keep with the water image, kind of sedimentation, where once the dust has settled amongst all of the competing translator demons that I have in my head, there's a way in which kind of things, again, I'll use another word I liked, coalesce. So I think it's not a bad way to describe my mental processing. But I would have to think about it more to kind of work out the analogy in detail.
Thank you for this amazing presentation. It was like very informative. And also the way you presented your work was so systematic that, I mean, I learned a lot. So my question is about like the economy of art production in that period in general. So this is the period like a little bit later or earlier. We see these super dense and complex Beyts. Also, we have around the same period, we have the emergence of album pages,
right,
or single standing portraits that are appearing in that period. Also, we have teskere that are like taking different bits of poems and putting them together. So, do you see any connection here between these like different artistic forms? And if you do, what could be like the historical circumstances like underlying?
Okay, well, another little direction I hadn't really gone in my head yet, but thank you. I will go there now. So one of the things that's happening during this period is there is, broadly speaking, and it's going to differ in Mughal India than it does in Safavid Iran, but there's a process in which you might call the decentering of patronage. All of a sudden there's a mercantile audience, there is an administrative class who are all participating in high culture. Right, and this is fairly new. This is something that really gets going in the 16th, and actually we can go back to the 15th century when you start to see this kind of diffusion of patronage, diffusion of audience. So, how, you asked, does that connect to your question? My proposal would be something along the lines is that there were lots of different ways that art could be consumed. Some of them really expensive. You wanted to buy, Sā'eb had an industry of producing copies of his divan. If you wanted a copy of the entire divan, hope your investments are going well, because these were the kind of books that were bought by emirs and, you know, just the super rich. But this poetry circulated in 101 other ways too. And so it's really nice to have a poem. I'll take another example. I'm going to start with him and probably should stop with him. But there are a number of his poems that have a really fascinating feature, which is they have two opening verses. Right? If you pull all the manuscripts together, they have two of these opening last. If you look at the manuscript tradition, almost every manuscript version only uses one of them. Right? So there's a performance decision. And what I'm getting to is the fact that this poetry often, Sā'eb was a writer. We know he physically wrote. He talks about writing. But his poems were also performed orally, and so it's good to have ways of switching things in and out, you know, short performance, long performance, that kind of thing. And I think that's part of the reason that these individual Beyts can circulate really widely, really quickly. And so you have, if you will, and I hate using modern mercantile imagery, but you had different ways of packaging for different price ranges, right? And so I think that has something to do with the fact that you have so many different forms, as you say, moraqa, these kind of calligraphy pages. There's any number of art mediums that you can get, if you will, entry level middle income level and high luxury versions of. And so I think that that might have something to do with it. Is that kind of getting at what you were asking about?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I have a kind of very pretentious way of asking the question I want to ask, and then I have a very immediate and practical way. So pretend I don't know my Deleuze or my Hegel, but I notice a lot of talk about dialectic, sort of, and to defend Hegel, basically briefly, sort of, it strikes me that kind of, for Hegel, even the total state or whatever, the kind of unity that a state has, you can speak of human beings outside of the state, and they have a value, sort of on their own. And then there is a process of sublation or change or whatever, and this culminates in a freedom. And so to make that sort of practical, I guess it struck me that when you, at the very beginning of the talk, when you talked about the definition of or the essence of the Ghazal,
right,
over 14 centuries or so, and then thinking of kind of the example of a reading group. So, if we have a reading group and it kind of, the members of the group aren't getting along, it falls apart after a while, nobody's really talking, there's enough of a sense, even though we're all particular people and have obviously value, that we can say that's a bad reading group or something like this, right?
Right,
so,
which is something I don't really want to do, right?
Right, so that was my question, is like, in different sort of periods of time, what would have been the expectations sort of this sort of form?
Right.
Like, are they very different? Is it kind of the longue durée when you get this sort of problem where you have to talk of assemblage or anyway?
Yeah, no, I think it changes. Is the big thing. That's why I hate essentialist definitions of the Ghazal, because I've read Ghazals in Arabic. I've read Ghazals over 1,000 years in Persian. To put it kind of coyly, I don't know what that is. I mean, I kind of go with Fran there, because I don't know what a Ghazal is. If you want me to give you a quick definition, I can define the form. But can I define it as an artistic thing? And yeah, I could maybe for the 12th century, if I looked at the 12th century, if I looked at a particular set of poets, I could do it another exercise, 3 centuries later with a different group of poets. I'm happy to talk about the Ghazal in that way, right? What drives me nuts is anything that says the true nature of the Ghazal. No. Oh, it puts me in a bad mood. As for Hegel, I'm going to keep this, I promise to keep this short. The problem with theories of society that Hegel's and that grow out of Hegel is that's what you have. You have society and you have individuals. Once the organic model of society breaks down, you have complete chaos. You have people, and so you have this politics. This is the politics of totalitarianism. If we don't control stuff, then you're all just going to kill each other, steal one another's foods. And so going back to the philosophical, this is what Deleuze and Guattari are after, is how do we talk about those things in between? The things that really seem to have no ontological value in traditional sociology. Talcott Parsons is a great example for now I'm going way back in my University of Chicago history. Bring up Talcott Parsons, oh my God. Anyway, I'm sorry. That was a joke that nobody except me was supposed to get. So does that kind of get to what you're...
Absolutely, I won't pursue the Hegel.
Okay, okay, yeah. Another day.
Thank you. Do they hear me? Okay. My question is a bit kind of naive and is related to the poet's or the author's relationship to the form, the Ghazal form. These verses are not formed naturally. I mean, they have clearly someone who is conscious of the form and putting them together, and who should also know how it works, right? Who has a clear idea of how the ghazal works. So this kind of mobile or moving modules, were all the poets aware of it, or each has a different
So
approach?
I think that everybody was aware of, so the big force, the big cohesive force, the big parameter is gharaz, and these topics of discourse, the purpose, written deep into the critical tradition. Every poet worth his salt would have known these things. The question is how much, you can do, I think Thibault was kind of alluding to this, you can read a single bait, and I can tell you the kind of poem it comes from. This is a love poem, or this is a poem of complaint, or this is that, and all I have to see is one verse. And so, yeah, so if you just put a series of these things, one verses together, where you kind of switch between topic and this and that, people would have been able to handle that. And I think they were perfectly aware of they were certainly aware of these larger forms. And you can, each one of these gharaz has a particular set of images associated with it, has a particular kind of tone that's associated with it. And yeah, that was part of what you needed to be able to do if you were a poet.
And any poets who write about their art, like in prose, explaining how?
Unfortunately, those are rare. I've been collecting examples since you've got one that I had from a poet named Mohtasham Kashani. His work is very unusual because it's an autobiography, or supposedly an autobiography, of his affair, first of all with a high-class courtesan, and then with a pretty boy of a noble household. So he swung both ways. But what's unusual about this is that he wrote ghazals for them. This was a form of social negotiation. This was a form of courtship. By the way, reciting a poet to your prospective partner still works wonders. But this was, but he actually writes about why he's doing this, right? So what is the, right? So I'm writing this poem because I want to make her jealous, right? I'm writing this poem. This one's kind of for myself, just to list all the reasons that I regret this affair. And so the few statements that we have are actually from poets, right, and not critics, but from poets, tend to be very aware of this kind of, they talk about this. Why critics didn't is kind of always a perennial problem in literary history. Poets are always way ahead of critics. But unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of first-person poetic testimony. There are a few other examples that I can pull up, but a lot of them actually come in the poems themselves, where poets will talk about what they're doing. So yeah. I thought this was a better background. And really, third floor of the Modern Wing at the Art Institute has an amazing collection of Cornell shadow boxes. It's kind of overwhelming.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the...
Okay. Well, I'm about to pull out a chair and sit down. So.
I'll be very brief. I was really fascinated by a comment you made. You said one of the reasons you think Sā'eb is getting a kind of reappraisal now is because he can entertain this complexity that speaks to our kind of current moment. But of course, it's also because of scholarship by people like you who make him more accessible for everybody else. But his kind of critical reception does strike me as quite interesting, because he has been unpopular for a few centuries now.
Yeah, 2.5.
So I wonder if you just have any thoughts about why he's been such a divisive poet, when clearly from your translations he was very sophisticated and
boy, that yeah, as you can imagine, that's a question that gets complicated really quick. One of the reasons I think is that he was a representative of that era when Persian was a transnational language, where, I mean, Sā'eb's poetry was literally known from the Ottoman Empire to the reaches of southern India, well into Central Asia. I mean, during his lifetime, he was the man. And I think it's precisely that kind of trans-regional appeal that, given the rise of nationalism, that's not a good thing. Because we can't just say he's Iranian. We can't even say, you know, he's one of these Indo-Persian poets, right? He moved back and forth, and you know, and so I think that's part of it. I also think part of it is the romantic sensibility. These are not poems of you know, daisies and daffodils and clouds moving through the sky and blah 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 blah. These are poems that are rational, right? They have this rational aspect to them, which really rubs against the grain of the Romantic tradition, which started in England but quickly made its way throughout certainly informed sensibilities in the Middle East from a very early time. And this stuff just is not, this is gnarly, knobbly poetry. This is not poetry that's, boy, how many sins of overgeneralization have I committed in the last half an hour? But this is not poetry that is necessarily, that necessarily focuses on the emotions and does that kind of thing. This is poetry that, you know, that you have to engage with, both emotionally and mentally, intellectually.